Over 108,000 Americans lost their lives to overdose in 2023. Just let that number sink in for a moment.
It's staggering.
And within that horrible number, something like 75,000 of those deaths are linked to fentanyl.
A substance that's incredibly potent.
Right, it's what, 50 times stronger than heroin?
And 100 times stronger than morphine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This isn't just some abstract public health issue anymore. It feels like a national tragedy.
It absolutely is. And it's become the leading cause of death for Americans aged 18 to 45.
The number one cause.
That's
It's
right.
hard to even comprehend.
It really highlights why we need to go deeper than just the surface level explanations.
Exactly. Because, when this comes up, the conversation often jumps straight to blaming other countries. China, Mexico.
That's an easy narrative, isn't it?
It is. But today, on the deep dive, that's what we want to pivot away from. Our mission here is to really dig into the domestic factors, what's driving this crisis inside the U.S.
Yeah, looking inwards.
We're using a really detailed article, lots of analysis, the latest data we could find. We want to equip you, our listener, with a solid understanding without, hopefully, making your head spin.
And it's so important to look beyond those, well, convenient scapegoats. This fentanyl crisis, it has deep roots right here at home.
Okay, so let's start there. Let's try and grasp the sheer scale of this. We have those initial numbers, shocking as they are, but put it in historical context for us.
Well, fentanyl's arrival has definitely made the opioid epidemic the deadliest drug crisis in American history. Period.
Worse than previous ones.
Significantly worse. The peak numbers we saw, roughly 114,000 deaths per year in both 2022 and 2023, that was overwhelmingly driven by fentanyl.
114,000 a year. That peak is just unbelievable. The article does mention some recent changes, though, maybe a slight positive trend.
Yes, thankfully, there has been a noticeable downturn recently. Since June 2023, overdose deaths have actually dropped by over 21%.
Wow, 21%, that's significant.
It is. It brought the total for a 12-month period below 90,000. That's the lowest it's been in almost 5 years. So, yes, that's definitely welcome news.
Okay, that's definitely a glimmer of hope in of a very grim picture. But it sounds like the threat level is still extremely high.
Oh, absolutely. The amount of fentanyl still being seized, especially at the border, is, frankly, alarming.
How much are we talking about?
Well, just in fiscal year 2024, up through August, Customs and Border Protection, CBP, they seized over 19,600 pounds.
19,000 pounds.
Yeah.
And considering how little it takes.
Exactly. Just 2 milligrams can be fatal. So that quantity represents just an enormous potential for loss of life.
And it's often disguised, right? That's part of the danger.
Yes, it's frequently pressed into counterfeit pills that look like legitimate prescription medications. People often have no idea what they're actually taking.
Which makes accidental overdoses so much more likely.
Precisely.
And the impact, it goes way beyond the loss of life itself, doesn't it? There's a huge economic cost attached to this.
Oh, without a doubt. The wider opioid epidemic was estimated to cost the U.S. around $1.5 trillion back in 2020 alone.
1.5 trillion. What does that even include?
It covers everything. You've got soaring healthcare costs, lost productivity from people unable to work, the strain on the criminal justice system, and then, of course, the sort of immeasurable cost of lives cut short.
And the personal toll.
Devastated families, fractured communities, and as we said, it's the leading killer of young adults. It's just heartbreaking when you think about the individual stories behind those statistics.
So when you're facing that kind of devastation, it's maybe natural to look for someone to blame. And like we said, the finger often points internationally, China and Mexico. What are the specific accusations?
The main ones you hear are, well, China is the key supplier of the precursor chemicals needed to make fentanyl.
The raw ingredients, basically.
Exactly. And then the Mexican cartels are accused of taking those chemicals, manufacturing the actual fentanyl, and then smuggling it across the border into the U.S.
And there have been official reports backing this up, or at least investigating it.
Yes. The article mentions a 2024 report from the House Select Committee on the CCP. It actually claimed the Chinese Communist Party directly subsidizes the export of these illicit fentanyl materials.
Directly subsidizes. That's a strong claim.
It is. And, if you look at the seizure data, it does seem to point heavily towards Mexico as the primary transit route.
What do those numbers show?
In 2024, CBP seized over 21,100 pounds of fentanyl coming from Mexico. Compare that to just 43 pounds seized coming from Canada.
Okay, yeah, 21,000 versus 43. That's a stark difference. And what about the policy reactions? We heard about tariffs, border actions.
Right. Back in March 2025, then President Trump imposed tariffs on goods from China, Mexico, and Canada. He specifically linked those tariffs to what he saw as their failure to stop fentanyl flow.
And how did those countries respond?
Well, Mexico deployed about 10,000 troops to its border,
Right.
which actually led to a temporary suspension of the tariffs against them. China made pledges too, promising stricter oversight on those precursor chemicals.
But it sounds like there are experts questioning if these kinds of pressure tactics are actually the best approach.
Yes, there's definitely skepticism. People like Mike Vigil, he's a former high-ranking DEA official, he's warned that these trade tensions could actually backfire.
How so?
They could damage the cooperation needed between countries to fight drug trafficking. And, ironically, that could end up benefiting the cartels by making coordinated efforts harder.
That's a really important counterpoint. Using economic weapons might actually weaken the fight against the drugs themselves. What do China and Mexico say in their own defense?
Well, both countries push back pretty hard against being the primary culprits. China highlights that they scheduled all fentanyl variants back in 2019.
Meaning they made them illegal to produce or sell?
Exactly. They were the only major country to do such a comprehensive ban at the time. They argue the real problem is the massive demand for opioids within the U.S.
So they're saying, we control the supply, you need to control the demand.
Essentially, yes. And they deny directly trafficking precursors to Mexico, specifically for illicit fentanyl production.
And Mexico. Their position seems like it might have evolved a bit.
It has. Initially, under President Lopez Obrador, there was some denial, or at least downplaying, of large-scale fentanyl production happening in Mexico, even when evidence emerged.
Like that big lab raid.
Right. The 2021 raid in Culiacan found a lab capable of churning out something like 70 million fentanyl pills a month. Hard to ignore.
70 million a month. Wow.
But the current president, Claudia Sheinbaum, seems to be taking a more aggressive stance. They've intensified efforts against the cartels. There was a huge seizure over a ton of fentanyl pills just last December in 2024.
Okay, so clearly there's an international component.
Yeah.
Precursors moving, drugs crossing borders. But the article argues pretty strongly that just blaming them misses a huge piece of the puzzle. Why does that blame abroad narrative fall short?
This is really where we need to turn the focus inward, because the article makes it clear. This crisis has deep, deep domestic roots.
Going back decades, right?
Absolutely. You have to trace it back to the massive overprescription of legal opioid painkillers, starting way back in the 1990s.
OxyContin, Vicodin, that era.
Exactly. That period essentially created a huge population of people who became addicted to opioids through legitimate prescriptions.
Driven by, well, aggressive marketing and maybe a shift in how pain was treated.
Yes, opioids were pushed heavily for chronic pain, sometimes inappropriately. And the healthcare system maybe didn't have the resources or focus for more comprehensive pain management. It created this pool of dependence.
Okay, so you have this large group of people addicted to prescription opioids. Then what happens?
Well, eventually awareness grew about the addiction problem and regulations tightened. Doctors prescribed fewer opioids, supplies dried up.
Creating a vacuum.
Precisely. And into that vacuum stepped the cartels offering illicit fentanyl. Why? Because it's incredibly cheap to produce compared to heroin, and it's vastly more potent. It met the demand that already existed.
And the head of the DEA even linked it back to the pharmaceutical industry.
Yes. DEA Administrator Ann Milgram basically said the U.S. pharmaceutical industry's role in that first wave of the opioid crisis, well, it laid the groundwork. It paved the way for fentanyl to take hold because the demand was already there, waiting.
And the supply chain for the precursors. It's not just China, is it? The article mentions other sources.
That's another key point. The cartels aren't solely dependent on China. They're adaptable. They source precursors from other places too, like India, even South Africa.
Because they have multiple suppliers.
And they even stockpile these chemicals. They plan ahead to avoid disruptions. It really drives home Mike Vigil's point. As long as we have that demand, there will be another country that will satisfy it. It's a global market responding to U.S. demand.
And there's a modern twist, too. The article mentions social media playing a role. That seems scary.
It is. Administrator Milgram highlighted this. Cartels are increasingly using social media platforms.
To do what? Sell drugs directly.
To advertise, to coordinate sales, to reach customers directly, especially younger people. It's a major and maybe underestimated part of how these drugs are distributed now.
So focusing only on foreign supply chains, besides being incomplete, it actually hurts our relationships with these countries.
It definitely seems to. The constant blaming has strained ties with both China and Mexico. Cooperation on counter-narcotics with China, which had potential, has basically stalled because of wider tensions.
And in Mexico, too.
Relations have been rocky. President Lopez Obrador even pulled Mexico out of the Merida Initiative for a time, which was a big framework for security cooperation.
So threatening tariffs or military action, that could just make things worse.
Experts like Vigil certainly warn against it. It risks alienating partners completely, shutting down vital intelligence sharing, and ultimately not solving the core problem.
Okay, so if pointing fingers outwards isn't the answer, what is? The article talks about needing a domestic solution. What does that look like?
Yes, it strongly pushes for prioritizing strategies within the U.S., tackling demand and reducing harm. It mentions Vanda Felba Brown's framework, which is pretty well known in policy circles.
Which involves what exactly?
It's basically three pillars: supply control, yes, but also demand reduction and harm reduction. The key argument is that we've historically over-relied on trying to stop the supply, and it just hasn't been enough. The cartels adapt too quickly.
Right, makes sense. So let's break down those domestic parts. Demand reduction first. What does that mean in practice?
It means tackling the why behind drug use. So, robust prevention and education programs, especially aimed at young people, trying to stop addiction before it starts.
Raising awareness, too.
Absolutely. Big public awareness campaigns about fentanyl's dangers, but also, crucially, working to destigmatize addiction, making it okay for people to ask for help without feeling ashamed.
And how are we doing on the treatment side of that?
Well, we've made progress in seeing substance use as a chronic illness, which is good. But the article notes that access to things like psychosocial treatment, therapy, counseling, and getting insurance to actually cover it properly is still a major hurdle for a lot of people.
Okay, so prevention, education, destigmatization. Then there's the treatment and a harm reduction piece. This can be controversial sometimes, but sounds essential here.
It really is critical, especially with something as deadly as fentanyl. Expanding access to medication-assisted therapy, or MAT, that's using medications like buprenorphine or methadone, along with counseling, is proven to be effective.
And things like naloxone.
Huge impact. Naloxone, the overdose reversal drug, its wider availability, now even over-the-counter, has undoubtedly saved countless lives. That's a major positive step.
What about fentanyl test strips?
Another vital harm reduction tool, they let people test other drugs for the presence of fentanyl before they use them. It gives people information to potentially avoid an accidental fatal overdose.
But scaling these things up costs money.
Exactly. To make MAT, naloxone, and test strips widely available to everyone who needs them requires serious investment from both federal and state governments. It's not cheap, but the cost of inaction is far higher.
And finally, the article mentions law enforcement, but maybe with a shift in focus, not just the border.
That's right. While border efforts continue, there's a growing emphasis on dismantling the drug distribution networks inside the United States, targeting the dealers and networks operating in our communities.
Are there specific operations doing this?
Yeah, the article mentions things like CBP's Operation Plaza Spike and Operation Apollo. These focus on targeting cartel plazas, their operational hubs, and working much more closely with state and local police.
But it's not just about arrests, is it?
No, and this is crucial. The article stresses that these law enforcement actions need to be paired with social programs. Programs that address the root causes driving drug use in the first place, things like poverty, lack of opportunity, mental health issues, social decay. Even Lopez Obrador pointed to these underlying issues in the U.S.
Okay, so pulling it all together, the main takeaway seems to be, yes, fentanyl comes from abroad, but the crisis itself is fundamentally a domestic problem needing domestic solutions.
Precisely. We need to shift the primary focus to addressing demand here at home through prevention, education, treatment, harm reduction, and yes, smart law enforcement focused domestically, all while trying to build real international partnerships based on cooperation, not just blame.
And it is encouraging, isn't it, that the recent numbers, the 21% drop in deaths, the higher seizures, suggest that maybe these more focused, multi-pronged strategies can actually start to make a difference.
It definitely offers some hope. It shows that when we apply evidence-based approaches consistently, we can see positive results. It's not hopeless.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, maybe here's something for you, our listener, to think about. Beyond the supply lines, beyond the policies we discussed, what are those deeper things in American society that fuel this persistent demand for opioids, for escape, for self-medication? What are the really long-term changes, maybe cultural, economic, social, that we might need to consider to truly break this cycle and prevent the next drug crisis? It's a big question. It goes way beyond just fentanyl. Definitely something worth reflecting on.